Let's Get This Podcast Started is a production of Get a Grip Studios. Welcome back. So, you're thinking about starting a podcast. You know, one of the things that we talk about here at the studio kind of in jest is that there are three types of failed podcasters. Now, if you go to a podcast network and you start scrolling through the myriad millions of shows that are out there, what you're going to find is there's a theme, and that a lot of podcasts seem to end in single digits of episodes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But they're still up there. And the reason they're still up there is because the person that started them continues to pay the networking fee. And so the podcast network accepts their $50 or $100 or whatever it is per year. Maybe it's a free one with ads. But they kind of have left the project undone. You know, they gave up on it. And the reason why they gave up on it is because creating a consistent podcast outside of doing the podcast itself is a lot of work. And so at Get a Grip Studios, we have come up with three types of failed podcasters. The first failed podcast is the podcast that never gets recorded. That's right. Most good podcast ideas never become podcasts because people just talk about doing it. Sometimes they even give a call to Get a Grip Studios. Sometimes they go looking around to the library that offers free podcast services, apparently, or Staples, and they look around at different places where they can record a podcast and they try it out. They talk to people. They have big ideas, but it never gets off the ground. Why? Because these people are tire kickers. That's what we call them. They come to our studio sometimes and they take pictures of the green screen in the background and what kind of green screen it is and the sound dampening equipment and what kind of mics we have. And we've seen these types. They like the idea of thinking about starting a podcast. And it gets them excited about the possibilities. But their concept never turns into reality because there's so much work to do to start a good, enduring podcast. It's not that expensive, but there's a lot of work and people get exhausted, even just trying to start. Which is why at Get a Grip Studios, when you work with us, the first thing you do is record a podcast. That's the first thing you do when you work with Get a Grip Studios is record a podcast. The second group of people that start podcasts, and that's what I was describing about the podcast network, we call these folks the bucket listers, right? So they're very similar to the tire kickers, except they actually pushed all the way through to the end and got a podcast up and out there. But man, it was a lot of work. Maybe they cranked out 6, 7, 9 episodes, but it's exhausting. So they throw the towel and they check that off their bucket list. It goes on to the F&CK list, the F-it list. And that's a good list sometimes. You need a good F-it list because you got to get some things off your plate from time to time. And a lot of times for us podcasters, it becomes the podcast. And that's so unfortunate because some podcasts are really good. They just don't have the resources they need. The third group of people that we talk about here at the studio is the egotistical narcissists. That's okay. I'm one of them. I mean, everyone, would say Colligan's a narcissist, but I don't really feel like I am, but some people would describe me that way. And I certainly was when I started my podcast. And it takes a little bit of that ego. Like if you think of yourself, think of things that are hard to do. Like, let's say you were going to climb in a cage and fight another man in the ring for the championship of the world. And you've never done this before. Well, that's why you see boxers and MMA fighters are very egotistical. They're very hyped on their own abilities. They think they can beat anybody. And sometimes you have to think that way when you're doing something super challenging. Like bootstrapping your own podcast, including recording, distribution, production, videos, all the stuff that goes on, marketing it and all that. You gotta be pushing hard and fighting hard and have a lot of confidence in yourself to push through all those barriers that are imposed by the production, distribution, promotion, guest acquisition, monetization problems that come up with podcasting. It takes a lot of time, or sometimes it's expensive. And so you need that ego push to get through it all. But you know what? If you go to getagripstudios.com, our website, we make starting a podcast really easy and affordable, actually. You can get off the ground real quick. And, we also have great advice on different topics to help guide you in the beginning, to help you understand what you're trying to do, what your mission is, and what's actually possible and what isn't. And sometimes just knowing, hearing someone else who's a successful podcaster, right? Over 800 podcasts I've recorded, all of them monetized. And that means I got paid. And, we've produced here at the studio 12, 13, 14 different shows. And we see a lot of people and talk to a lot of people about starting podcasts. And so if you go to getagripstudios.com, I would tell you, be a guest on the Let's Get This Podcast Started podcast. $49. Check it out. And then on top of that, you could, in that podcast, you do a podcast with me or Scott Wachter or Webster Marsh or one of the other people in our network. You're going to learn a lot about what it takes to start a podcast. So go to getagripstudios.com. Thank you for listening. Let's Get This Podcast Started is a production of Get a Grip Studios. Do you want to start a podcast? Do you need help with your existing podcast? Do you want to record some conversations or a presentation? Do you want to be a guest on Let's Get This Podcast Started? Go to getagripstudios.com.